The world of secret agents is, by its very nature, woven with shadows, its histories recorded in whispers, encoded in glances, and passed, sometimes, in the uncertain bravery of a silent night. As the world lurched toward war in the late 1930s, America's clandestine warriors operated at the unexplored edge between diplomacy and danger. Their existence was defined not only by missions and means, but by a profound loneliness, a certainty that the most decisive battles might be won or lost in the anonymity of foreign cities. To step into this realm is to follow lives shaped by constant vigilance, ingenuity, and attention deep as winter frost. It is to become, if only for a moment, acquainted with the cost and complexity of fighting for a country in places where trust is rare luxury, danger is routine, and success is measured by secrets delivered rather than medals earned. Long before the world was engulfed in the flames of total war, before bombs shattered cities and armies, clashed openly on endless battlefields, there existed another, more secret conflict quietly taking shape. This was a war fought not with guns or tanks, but with shadows, whispers, and coded messages passed in the darkened corners of foreign cities. It was a contest of wits and nerves, where the lives of a few could change the fate of millions. For the United States, the years before the outbreak of World War II marked the birth of this hidden struggle, a delicate and dangerous dance in the very heart of an enigmatic and imposing Soviet Union. America, still recovering from the scars of the Great War and heavily influenced by doctrines of isolationism, approached the looming threat across the Atlantic with reluctance. Isolationism proved a fragile shield in the storm gathering across Europe and Asia. Fascism's rapid ascent under Adolf Hitler in Germany and the uncertainty surrounding Joseph Stalin's Soviet regime made clear that the world balance was shifting. Yet much of America's leadership remained divided or unaware of the magnitude of the threat. Behind the scenes, however, a small but determined group of intelligence officers, naval attaches, diplomats, and spies were dispatched abroad with a secret mission: to observe, to listen, and to quietly prepare for the inevitable. The United States was, at this time, ill-equipped for this shadow war. Unlike the more established European secret services, the British MI6 or the Soviet GPU and NKVD, the American intelligence apparatus, was fragmented and decentralized. The Office of Naval Intelligence handled naval reconnaissance and spying, especially in Asia and Europe, while the Military Intelligence Division concentrated on Army-related intelligence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation focused largely on domestic counter-espionage matters rather than foreign operations. A handful of diplomats and attaches stationed worldwide acted as the eyes and ears of Washington, using their cover to gather vital human intelligence. This patchwork system, while earnest, was far from sophisticated. Among the most perilous and enigmatic of these assignments was the posting in Moscow, where American agents sought to penetrate the veil of Stalin's Soviet Union. Moscow was not just a city, but a fortress of suspicion. It was the capital of a country ruled by an all-encompassing secret police that brooked no dissent or light shedding. Foreign diplomats and suspected spies were under near-constant observation by the NKVD, a secret police force efficient and brutal, capable of extracting confessions through terror and turning prisoners into unwitting double agents. To be an American agent in Moscow was to walk on the edge of a knife, constantly aware the next step might plunge into danger, arrest, or disappearance. For a young naval attache arriving in Moscow in the late 1930s, the experience was one of both awe and dread. The city was alive with contradictions. Soviet propaganda banners preaching peace and progress hung ominously above streets filled with quiet fear, where each citizen seemed to watch those around them as carefully as they were watched. American spies, officially diplomatic staff or commercial representatives, entered a world carbonized by paranoia. They learned quickly that masks must never slip, that every word was potentially recorded or overheard, and every contact had to be measured against the possibility of betrayal. Take, for example, Michael Alden, a composite representation of early American agents operating there. Posing as a naval attaché with ties to American shipping companies, Alden was fluent in Russian and adept at blending in. He spent hours observing Soviet naval activity on the Baltic coastline, gathering scraps of information, rumors passed in cafes, slight shifts in harbor activity, even the patterns of bureaucratic appointments within the military. Yet each routine day was laced with annoying tension. Alden was aware that across the city, informants and NKVD agents might be tracking his every meeting, every step. Their communications were encrypted and ritualized, relying on dead drops, small caches where messages or delicate microfilm could be deposited and retrieved under cover of night. Invisible ink, tiny symbols hidden behind postage stamps or inside innocuous letters, carried information that could alter strategic calculations at the highest levels. Transmission by radio was limited to brief, coded bursts, always with the looming threat that Soviet signal trackers were listening and converging. Trust was scarce. Agents avoided face-to-face meetings whenever possible, choosing instead indirect handoffs or secretive coded conversations. They sought alliances with emigrants, Russian exiles, or discontented intellectuals. Yet these contacts themselves were exposed to unimaginable risk. Many were caught, tortured, or never heard from again. Beyond the operational difficulties, the American agents confronted a vast cultural and ideological chasm. Many arrived with limited knowledge of Russia's history, language, or the depths of Stalin's purges, which had destroyed millions in violent waves of mistrust and execution. The Soviet state was suffused with propaganda, censorship, and fear. It shaped and distorted normal human interaction. For Americans, maintaining cover sometimes required suppressing fundamental beliefs, pretending acceptance of the Communist Party's revolutionary ideals, while privately questioning the regime's brutality. Some developed complicated sympathies or humanized friendships with local contacts. Others became hardened, skeptical, even cynical after witnessing the dark realities beneath Soviet slogans. The espionage network in Russia was just one node in a larger web stretching across the continent and beyond. American intelligence maintained a presence in Berlin, where agents carefully shadowed the machinations of Nazi Germany. Here, spies found themselves navigating a city increasingly under the iron fist of the Gestapo, a place where arrest meant disappearance or worse. They cultivated contacts in German military circles, businessmen disillusioned with the rise of fascism, and government functionaries with access to secret plans or production statistics for tanks and aircraft. Similarly, in Tokyo and elsewhere in Asia, naval attaches and clandestine officers observed Japan's rapid militarization and expansionist ambitions. Intelligence there relied heavily on interpretation of Japanese political factionalism and naval deployments. Neutral cities such as Istanbul, Stockholm, and Geneva functioned as nerve centers for information exchange and covert meetings. From these diplomatic havens came some of the most critical intelligence on Axis deployments, supply chains, and internal disputes. However, the absence of a centralized agency sometimes slowed coordination, causing gaps in America's understanding of enemy intentions and capabilities. These early years of intelligence gathering were marked by betrayals, miscalculations, and painful lessons. The notorious Munich Agreement of 1938 and the rapid fall of Poland in 1939 shocked the world and prodded American intelligence agencies into more urgent action. Yet reports of Nazi war plans or the extent of Stalin's ruthless purges often arrived piecemeal or were dismissed by politicians unwilling to face inconvenient truths. Nonetheless, these early operations laid the foundation, the rudimentary but critical groundwork for what would become a vast intelligence network during the war. Perhaps the greatest challenge was the nature of espionage itself, the constant precarious balance between remaining undetected and obtaining actionable intelligence. Diplomatic cover provided agents a shield under international law, but it was an often thin protection against harassment, house searches, interrogations, or expulsion. The NKVD's skill in surveillance meant that any American move was carefully tracked. A wrong invitation or an unfamiliar face at a meeting was all it took to attract unwanted attention. Agents learned to vanish into crowds, to use coded language, even in casual conversations, and, if necessary, to destroy potentially incriminating documents at a moment's notice. The slow, deliberate 6 years before America fully entered World War II were also years where America's secret warriors endured uncertainty and isolation. Often separated by continent and culture from their commanders in Washington, these men and women worked tirelessly in an environment where emotional and physical risk was constant. Their reports fed into a growing intelligence mosaic, guiding policymakers who were still reluctant to abandon the policy of neutrality. With the onset of war in Europe, the United States gradually recognized the importance of a unified intelligence structure. The creation of the Office of Strategic Services in 1942 centralized clandestine activities and expanded the scale and daring of espionage missions. But the lessons learned and networks built in Moscow and similar outposts in the years before the conflict proved indispensable. Before the first shots were fired across Europe's borders, in cold embassy rooms, smoke-filled cafes, and city streets shadowed by suspicion, the American secret agents had already begun the dangerous work of espionage. Working unseen and unheard, often without recognition or hope of glory, they forged the invisible wires that would support the Allied war effort in the darkest of times. Measures devised then: dead drops, invisible ink, clandestine radio communication, and the nerve forged walking the tightrope between detection and discovery, endured as the defining tools of espionage for decades to come. And though many stories of heroism remain buried under decades of secrecy, it was in these opening acts before the world's Great War that the American clandestine service laid the cornerstone of its future. The arrival in Moscow was a study in stillness. Each step into the city's early dawn met with an almost physical resistance, a wall built from suspicion and silence. Any fresh American operative, invited in under the dull pretext of naval attache or cultural liaison, sensed it immediately. Every movement was catalogued, every friend a potential adversary, every moment outside the embassy another roll of fate's loaded dice. The city itself circularly pressed in. Wide, snow-shrouded boulevards led to grand squares adorned with banners of the party. Behind the cold beauty, the lives of Moscow's citizens played out in quiet half-light. Here, no foreign agent could ever truly be invisible. The NKVD had more than a reputation. They were a ubiquitous presence. No matter how many precautions the Americans took, the feeling of being watched never faded. Tails shifted discreetly outside official residences, their overcoats forming a silent, unbroken line that mirrored each would-be spy's every path from embassy gate to inconspicuous cafe. Caution was everything. These agents quickly abandoned naive notions of Hollywood heroics for a discipline born of necessity. Breakfasts were solitary affairs, observed through frost-glazed windows. Walks were mapped by routine, but varied by timing. Each path witnessed, measured. Any visit from a friendly local came with the knowledge that even couriers and translators, faces made familiar through daily repetition, might in fact report every word and gesture to secret police. Still, survival depended not just on vigilance, but on adaptation. For American operatives, communication became art. Messages were cut into the margins of tattered newspapers, inked with lemon juice or milk onto postcards, destined for a hidden companion who knew, through some unspoken training, how to read the faint outline under the lamp's soft glow. Code phrases exchanged at the ice rink or crowded tram stop were recited with the same casual air as small talk, yet every word layered with double meaning. In the hum of the midnight city, with engines turning the snow to slush, secret handoffs and urgent glances gave birth to a clandestine lexicon of survival. The tension was constant, but within it, moments of improvisation and daring revealed the fragile humanity beneath official veneers. Sleepless nights were spent burning sensitive documents in a bathtub, smoke drawn out with running water and lemon-scented soap to cover any trace. An agent, roused by a midnight knock, would surreptitiously swallow a microdot order or slip a coated film canister under the floorboards, while recalling every false name used in the last 24 hours. None of these agents worked alone, but connections formed between them were necessarily ambiguous. Assignments were compartmentalized, for trust was a thing to be rationed. The knowledge that a careless or captured colleague could be turned by force hung over each meeting like the city's ever-present fog. At times, teamwork came not from confidence in one another, but knowing that exposure meant disaster for everyone, creating a silent, powerful bond. No full names, only cover stories, only precise, remembered tasks that could be wiped clean in the press of an instant. Some survived their postings by feigning a deeper loyalty to the party line than their Soviet observers, overplaying knowledge of Russian poets, attending state performances, offering genuine critique of Western orchestras to fit the mold of the dutiful. If thoroughly out of touch, foreign diplomat, others struck subtle bargains. An American might offer a rare bar of chocolate or carton of American cigarettes in exchange for a whisper of troop movements from a nervous minor functionary desperate for escape. But the cost was steep. Where there were allies, there were always double agents, forced by the NKVD or lured by their own calculations. Men and women once thought loyal vanished without a trace or returned altered, their eyes haunted by unspeakable knowledge. Rumors swirled through embassy corridors. An attache's driver, perhaps, had reported infractions directly to Soviet handlers, while a secretary who grew too intimate with local journalists found herself spirited away for questioning, never to return. Through all this, rumors of something larger brewing swelled alongside the river's thaw. The city's pulse was quickening. Train stations echoed with the tramp of boots, and officials whispered of purges in regions far from Moscow's center. Beneath the endless churn of routine, spying, reporting, fearing, hoping, the Americans could sense something shifting. Their nightly reports, cabled back to Washington in script both plain and encoded, began to hint at the darkness gathering just beyond the range of the city's flickering lamps. It was a season defined not by victories, but by endurance, a test of nerve and cleverness, patience and the art of passing undetected in a place where detection meant calamity. As spring followed winter, the daily trials of these spies continued, their stories building one upon another, layered with the details of lives lived at constant risk. And beyond Moscow, as the world tumbled into open war and the map of conflict expanded, the experience learned in these first bitter months would prove invaluable. The agents sharpened by Moscow's ever-watchful eyes would soon find themselves bound for stranger, more perilous assignments, drawn outward by a world descending into war, where silence was both armor and weapon, and the shadows lengthened over new and unfamiliar lands. The world beyond Moscow, as war devoured Europe and whispers of alliances and invasions stretched from the chill Nordics to the parched coastlines of the Mediterranean, became the next proving ground for American secret agents. Each new city, every unfamiliar continent, arrived with its own code of conduct, its culture of danger. Once, the danger was found in a neighbor's glance or a bugged apartment wall. Now it flickered from the beam of a German searchlight, the shuffle of boots in a Paris back alley, or the hard-edged warning in an Italian partisan's eyes. When the world slipped finally and fully into the abyss of global war, the United States responded not only with armies and fleets, but with a new, bolder kind of intelligence warfare. The quietly built foundation in Moscow, and the skills honed struggling against near-invisible Soviet surveillance, allowed American operatives to expand outwards at furious speed. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSSEs, was born, a new experimental body that drew from academia and industry, adventurers and scholars, all trained in the sharp art of clandestine operations. Spies and special operatives were dispatched not solely into Russia or Germany, but into all the corners of a darkening Earth. In neutral Stockholm, American agents moved through grand hotels, silverware clinking in marble-floored dining rooms, as coded notes passed beneath linen napkins. Sometimes neutrality just meant the fighting was quieter. The presence of German, British, Soviet, and American spies in the same cocktail lounge required a deafness beyond even the most rigorous spy school. In Istanbul, another crossroads city, information flowed as freely as the Bosporus, blockaded cargo runs, troop movements, as secret inclinations of Balkan kings. Yet the work here was anything but romantic. Every meeting in a quiet park could be a trap baited by a double agent. Alliances with local resistance movements, French, Yugoslav, Greek, brought hope and peril in equal measure. Spies operated in rented garrets, hoarding gasoline and ink, bribing constables, and taking elaborate precautions that, by day's end, could vanish in a glimpse of betrayal. Passers-by in a Parisian cafe might be a German informer, and even a fellow operative's name was never recorded in full. American operatives learned that in France, the greatest shield was often anonymity oneself. A hat pulled low, a newspaper angled high, a voice lost in the baritone rumble of crowd. On a rain-soaked quay, a parcel with intricate microfilm would pass between hands in less time than a spilled espresso. In a back room, a wounded resistance fighter might be nursed with stolen penicillin, secrets exchanged over the soft hiss of a kerosene lamp. Where France demanded subtlety, Spain's shadows turned harsher. Even neutrality was relative in a world where every port hosted 3 secret services and all telephones might be tapped. Here, bribes became more expensive, and so did human life. The Watchers were everywhere, and superpower intrigue masked the sordid deals of smugglers, assassins, hopeful defectors, and the desperate. The tall marble lobbies of Madrid hotels filled with gossip, cryptic communiques scrawled in Spanish, English, or even Polish, and the certainty that at least one man was listening for the Gestapo. In the Balkans, the enemy changed face as quickly as the landscape. No broad boulevards now, but goat tracks, thickets, flooded meadows, terrain nearly as dangerous as the men who policed it. American agents here learned a brutal breed of espionage, carrying radio parts piece by piece through the snow to partisan hideouts, mapping Axis supply convoys from the shattered attic of the Serbian farmhouse, melting into local militias when the front lines blurred. Contacts changed by the week, codes by the day. War made everyone suspect. Survival, even more so. Tradecraft in these days was a blend of old-world chivalry and cold mathematics. Burn everything in a moment, trust no one more than a little, be ready to improvise. A missed radio check could mean a cell had been captured. A different waiter at the usual table, the warning had to be acted on instantly. Messages passed inside priests' prayer books or through a child's drawing became the currency of a war where information was measured in hours, and every hour lost might spell disaster for 1,000 men. Yet there was more than tension and paranoia. Sometimes unexpected, a camaraderie blossomed. A network leader, once a Parisian schoolteacher, confessed her dreams for after victory. A Spanish contact, lost at the edge of political despair, found hope in a relief shipment delivered just in time. The IAS itself built a culture apart. Operatives drank together in rare off hours, swapping stories, playing cards for futures they dared only imagine. The war, while it raged outside, forced intimacy, trust built on need, sometimes friendship, more often the silent acknowledgement that one's own life was invested in the judgment, speed, and cunning of the stranger across the table. Everything was compartmentalized. The sum of America's espionage in wartime Europe was a puzzle known fully to no one. One agent might sabotage a rail line in Norway, never knowing who sent the code, nor the fate of the men on the train. Others mapped German fuel reserves in Romania, or trained sappers in Greece, or posed as journalists in Budapest, their reports flowing back to London or Washington like droplets in a roaring ocean. Occasionally, mistakes were catastrophic. A single missing word in a radio transmission brought an entire network down, and the brutal mechanics of Gestapo retribution left only silence where Allies once stood. But the work went on, because it had to. Consuming and often anonymous, it reshaped the agents themselves. Some grew rigid and cynical, others sparked by righteous anger at what they witnessed, all changed by experience etched unseen onto their souls. The victories were seldom clear, the cost, in human terms, harrowing. Beneath all the movement, all the coded radios and burned ciphers, throbbed a sense of continuous urgency. That this secret war behind the war, this daily fight for information and survival, might yet turn the tide for millions who would never know the names of those who fought it. War demanded the extraordinary, and the extraordinary became these operatives' daily fare. Each knew, somewhere deep, that the shadows would always be waiting, with risk, with hope, and perhaps at last, with the faint promise of a world returned from the edge. The war made strangers into allies, but nowhere were the boundaries between friend and foe more dangerously blurred than in Moscow. As the Nazi armies threatened the gates of the Soviet capital, and the world's fate hung in the balance, American agents found themselves working side by side, or rather side by suspicion, with their Soviet hosts. The city's heartbeat was a constant anxiety. Sirens in the night, whole blocks going dark at once, secret meetings in the shadow of Kremlin towers. For the Americans, the war in Moscow was a daily test not just of nerves, but of imagination. How to gather truths behind a veil of lies, how to depend on an alliance that felt just another front. An embassy staffer might rise with the dawn to the sound of boots crunching snow, the entire building haunted by a knowledge that every telephone, every room, was bugged. Breakfast was often eaten facing a window, aware the faces across the street might belong to NKVD minders, scribbling in their little books. But outwardly, routine persisted. The Americans learned to navigate the city with controlled indifference. They took the tram, lingered at the gum department store, visited necessary museums and theaters, always careful never to walk the same street 2 days running. Invitations to official banquets were accepted with polite enthusiasm, fingers drumming coded rhythms on the table whenever they felt the eyes of the secret police. The pretense of alliance demanded endless performance. Joint committees to arrange military supply shipments, cultural exchanges that were little more than ceremonies of mutual suspicion, dinners that featured toasts to Allied victory presided over by men who would, once the glasses were drained, return to their respective offices and pull out files stamped secret. Every shared cigarette, every American joke about Washington, every Soviet anecdote about Siberian trains could be meaningful or meaningless, a riddle with hints scattered in half-heard conversations. The city's public spaces were transformed by necessity into a labyrinth of signals. In one city park, an American officer would buy a copy of Pravda, not to read, but to signal a contact hiding in the benches. At a nearby tram stop, a Russian informant might leave a handkerchief atop a statue's pedestal, a code agreed upon after weeks of indirect negotiation, always subject to abrupt change if anyone suddenly stopped showing up. Every store clerk was a possible informant, every taxi driver a potential collector or relay for whispers passing between embassies and the shadows. Contacts were terrifyingly ephemeral. A chef at a Western restaurant might leap the timing of a secret police roundup for the price of a carton of imported cigarettes. An interpreter could slide a telephone number across the bar in exchange for the promise, always ambiguous, of a new life far from the chill and suspicion. Trust in this world was a currency more valuable and unstable than gold. Double agents were a constant, and sometimes the only way to measure loyalty was to see who disappeared and who kept coming back, quiet and unchanged. But the line between loyalty and betrayal was more than a professional dilemma. There were moments, rare and raw, when an American operative found themselves being asked for help, not as a spy, but as a person, with the unspoken hope that there was something more human than ideology at work. Sometimes, late at night, in an embassy corridor after a state dinner, the hesitance in a question revealed the truth of a city. Families gone, friends banished, only the persistent uncertainty of tomorrow. From the American perspective, the irony cut deep. The Soviets, ostensibly partners, seemed no less eager to learn the secrets of their allies than those of their enemies. It was not uncommon to discover that a genteel language instructor or embassy driver had been recruited by the NKVD to spy on American guests, to report every habit, every visitor, every comment made in frustration or fatigue. Files filled with careful notations about the books Americans checked out of the library, how long they lingered at a concert, whether they frowned in line at the bakery, would find their way into the Soviet intelligence bureaucracy, forming the basis of a massive psychological portrait whose intended use was never quite clear. Despite this, the business of intelligence continued. Reports were packed in microfilm, hidden in the heel of a shoe, passed through diplomatic pouches, or couched in the bland language of logistics updates. Each transmission to Washington carried within it an entire city's worth of shadows and risks. Decisions had to be made quickly and quietly, with the knowledge that a careless phrase could cost a source their freedom, or worse. There was no official playbook, only improvised tradecraft, honed by fear, necessity, and endless practice. It was in this environment that the line between agent and ordinary person blurred most completely. Every party, every parade, every stilted lunch with a Soviet official could turn from routine to confrontation in an instant. There were stories, half rumored, of Americans quietly reassigned, recalled, or, in rare cases, detained as unfriendly elements. Of local contacts invited to questioning who never returned. Of sudden, baffling shifts in Soviet mood or policy that left operatives guessing at the invisible battles being fought in back rooms and government offices. And beneath all this, the awareness that as the Allies pushed the Nazis ever closer to defeat, this alliance was sharp-edged and temporary. Even before the final shots were fired in Europe, new divisions appeared in the frantic memoranda between Washington and Moscow. Americans learned to save files twice, once for the future and once for insurance against the friends of today becoming the adversaries of tomorrow. The handwriting on the wall was written in codes. Today's comrade was tomorrow's counteragent. Through it all, the city itself became a participant in the shadow play, gray and beautiful under winter snow, echoing with the boots of soldiers and the quiet paranoia of a people surveilled from every corner. Each passing week, American operatives understood better what it meant to serve in an environment where every truth was provisional, every relationship a wager, and every day a silent gamble against the tide of history. As the Allies marched across Europe and the Soviets themselves plotted the world's next division, those few Americans who survived Moscow's relentless shifting game would bring home a new awareness that loyalty was never absolute, and that in the end, the greatest risk was not just to life or limb, but to the very soul. They did not yet know it, but the war was about to end, and the long, bitter season of peace would begin with just as many secrets and shadows as had accompanied them through the heart of Moscow. Far from the stone shallows of Moscow and the embattled capitals of Europe, another front called to America's secret agents. The vast, unfamiliar sweep of Asia. Here, the rhythms were different, the dangers unique, the stakes every bit as dire. The world's oldest civilizations, newly scarred by occupation and civil war, became intense arenas of intelligence work, a place where anonymity was not just cover, but survival, and where the boundaries between spy, guerrilla, and ordinary citizen blurred to invisibility. To arrive in China, Burma, Indochina, or the Pacific was to land in a whirlwind of languages and alliances. American operatives, some barely in their 30s, others well-lived wandering adventurers, found their days shaped by the roar of enemy planes, the whisper of monsoon rains, the anxiety of names written in unfamiliar scripts. Unlike the controlled chaos of Moscow or the coded routines of Paris, here the threat was omnipresent, the possibility of being unmasked or betrayed made ever sharper by landscape and culture. A train ride became an exercise in suspicion. Jungle paths grew deadly, as much through ignorance as through cunning hostile patrols. Physical disguise mattered almost as much as codes or radio signals. A badly trimmed beard, a wrong dialect uttered in a marketplace, could spell the end. American espionage in Asia was ruthless improvisation. In Japanese-occupied China, the line between agent and resistance leader frequently vanished. The bravest operatives, figures like Virginia Hall and her peers, moved through war zones on prosthetic limbs, sending coded signals from villages lined with bamboo and battered hopes. Each mission meant days spent learning the slow language of trust. A grain merchant in Guangdong, a local priest in Rangoon, a school teacher willing to relay troop sightings in Hanoi. Payment wasn't always money. It could be a promise of medicine for a sick child, or safe passage for a family, or simply a vow, never spoken aloud, that liberation would come. Radio transmissions, essential elsewhere, became acts of desperate courage here. In the dense hills and jungles, every burst of code meant risking detection by Japanese direction-finding teams, well-trained and brutal in their pursuit. Equipment was heavy, batteries unreliable, and failure to transmit at the appointed hour meant not just the collapse of a network, but often the loss of entire villages to reprisal. More than once, agents signaled under the cover of monsoon thunder, using the sound to mask their Morse, wondering if friends in India or Washington would ever hear their call for help. Disguises in Asia proved more than hats and overcoats. Operatives wore the clothing of farmers, priests, market vendors. They learned to barter in coins marked with imperial crests and to bow just so in foreign temples. Houses friendly to the cause became orphanages by day, schoolrooms by night, kitchens by necessity, and safe houses always. Outsiders passed as traveling painters or doctors. All eyes in these places were rarely lifetime professionals. They were the brave, the cornered, those with nothing to lose. Each one knew that the penalty for discovery was swift and final: imprisonment, execution, the ruination of families. There was power in alliances, but also in loneliness. The American agents, once products of universities or factories, great cities or small towns, felt the distances here with acute intensity. Mistaken identity and misunderstanding could be lethal. Messages misheard and misinterpreted led to missed connections, wasted journeys, sometimes tragedy. Still, in the adrenaline and fear, the rolling sweep of mountains and forests, there was a kind of kinship. An American taught a Chinese partisan how to wire explosives on a rail bridge, or shared stories with a Burmese guerrilla leader by a smoky fire, each finding in the other a measure of unspoken trust. Asia's espionage demanded new skills and new tradecraft. Agents learned codes as knot-based patterns tied into sashes, recognized allies by riverboat songs, and hid instructions inside bamboo flutes or the stitching of tunics. Daring extractions became the stuff of late-night whispers. A wounded pilot snatched from a rice paddy at dawn. A scientist spirited out under the noses of an entire garrison. The resourcefulness of the under-equipped, hungry, and hopeful counted as much as any plan crafted in Washington or London. And everywhere, the possibility of betrayal was an ever-present ghost. The Japanese occupiers prized informants, paid in coin, or the illusion of safety. A market vendor might sell a day's secrets as quickly as apples or fish. A betrayed radio operator would vanish, leaving only silence and a warning for the next visitor. Yet there were victories, small, unsung, sometimes anonymous. A city block delivered from bombardment. A train derailed at exactly the right hour. A shipment of penicillin, never accounted for, turning up in a hastily constructed jungle clinic. American agents, their faces unknown to all but the most trusted locals, became the whispered hope that the tides might turn, the war might, one night, be different. What separated this theater from the ruined cities of Europe was the relentless rhythm of uncertainty and adaptation. Rules learned in Moscow or Paris rarely applied. Every region's customs and dangers were different. In the end, it was not formal training or even official sanction that kept these agents alive. It was instinct, improvisation, the hard-won ability to blend in, and above all, the bravery of those who joined them at terrible risk for a cause greater than any one life. As the war thundered on and the world's fates were decided by armies and nations, it was in these hidden places, the flooded rice fields, mountain valleys, shanty towns, and jungle huts, that America's shadow war reached its greatest extremes. Here, the secret agent was not just a collector of intelligence, but a symbol, sometimes the last hope or the first sign that the world might not be as lost as it seemed. There was a science to secrecy, and as the war escalated, the methods became as inventive as the stories behind each new encoded message and covert operation. For American agents scattered across divided continents, technology and tradecraft evolved into daily instruments of both survival and sabotage. In hidden basements, cramped attic rooms, and the clandestine corners of embassies, men and women hunched over ciphers, radios, and curious devices, trusting that their skills could buy enough time, enough silence, for mission and messenger alike. The core of their world turned on the fragile power of codes and ciphers. Orders and discoveries traveled not as words, but as patterns, layers of meaning buried beneath what looked like nonsense. Coded messages were constructed on one-time pads, so complex they could never be broken, so long as each page was truly unique and never reused. A missed detail, a repeated page, could spell disaster. Teams in Washington and London raced to decrypt Axis messages, but every agency knew its own encryption was never safe enough. Techniques shifted daily, a line of verse embedded in a love letter, numbers disguised as harmless financial reports, microdots squeezed onto a grain of film smaller than the period at the end of a sentence. Gadgets grew more ingenious by the month. Portable radios assembled from scavenged parts allowed agents half a world away to tap out critical news in Morse code that, with luck, would reach friendly ears instead of enemy direction finders. Tiny cameras, covertly built into cigarette lighters, pens, or eyeglass cases, could snap quick evidence of troop deployments or secret blueprints. Suitcases with false bottoms hid documents for miles or days. Even innocuous objects, like coins and buttons, were hollowed to carry money, poison, or the tiniest fraction of information. The greatest risk was exposure, the endless race between those who wanted a secret kept and those determined to wrench it into daylight. The enemy had mobile listening teams, vans packed with arrays of antennae cruising silent streets, searching for the triangulated source of a stray signal, forcing American and Allied agents to move constantly, change locations, and bury equipment under floorboards or inside fireplace flues. Any slip, a rogue radio frequency, the clumsy repetition of a code phrase, might bring a crash on the door late in the night. There were stories, quietly told, of desperate measures when things went wrong. The sudden, frantic burnings of documents in a hotel bathtub, with towels stuffed under the door and water running in the sink. Operatives who carried cyanide pills in the lining of a coat resolved not to be taken alive. Microfilm orders dropped down drains, codebooks torn and swallowed in seconds. A last defense when the circle had closed too quickly to run. But espionage was not only about staving off disaster. It was also about adaptation and improvisation, sometimes inspired, sometimes forced by circumstance. As codes leaked or devices failed, new methods grew. Signal patterns changed at the first hint of compromise. Rendezvous points shifted at the sight of a different newspaper vendor, or the sound of a wrong accent on the corner. Even the words used in everyday speech inside embassies and safe houses fluctuated, as code names and terms for vital operations were invented and discarded with dizzying speed. This restless creativity became the hallmark of the war's hidden struggle. It was a game of constant adjustment, where technological advances could mean the margin between success and catastrophe, and where ingenuity was as necessary as courage. The agents who lived this chaos became masters of the unexpected, always one step from the razor's edge, trusting both their training and their instincts, and above all, learning to never rely on the same method twice. As the world's armies clashed over lines on maps, the networks beneath the surface worked with feverish speed and endless caution. Intelligence that once seemed delayed or impossible now traveled faster than armies could move. Briefcases dropped in Paris could change the plans of generals in far-off rooms. A single phrase cracked in an overheard transmission might force midnight orders that turned the tide of battle. Through it all, those who managed the science of secrecy, who protected and deceived, invented and adapted, carried the weight of knowing that, in war, a secret kept was often as powerful as a victory won. As the war's brutal churning neared its end, the pressures on America's secret agents grew even sharper, and nowhere was this more evident than in the frantic final stretch of mission after mission, some aimed at tipping the course of battle, others at preparing for a peace likely to be as uncertain and hazardous as the conflict itself. The rules kept shifting beneath their feet. A friend one week could be a competitor or even an enemy the next, and the delicate arrangements of wartime allegiance were poised to unravel just as the smoke of battle began to clear. With the Axis powers faltering, priorities for American operatives shifted with astonishing speed. The days of mapping troop movements and organizing sabotage transformed, in the war's waning months, into a tense race to secure information and individuals who would be the currency of whatever world emerged after the shooting stopped. Missions took on a feverish urgency, securing dossiers on Nazi leaders who had perpetrated horrors across Europe, copying secret lists and files to be used in war crimes tribunals or as leverage in post-war negotiations, sometimes spiriting away scientists, engineers, and defectors who carried knowledge critical to future military and economic strength. Escape routes were quietly, desperately laid, not just for American agents themselves, whose covers were often blown or rendered obsolete by approaching Allied armies, but for resistance fighters, informants, whole families who had risked everything working with the shadow networks. The goodbyes were often wordless or rushed, the alliances strained by the knowledge that for some, a new war in the form of occupation, political persecution, or Cold War suspicion was about to begin. These last operations were complicated by the shifting political weather. As Berlin fell and Tokyo's surrender loomed, lines were drawn with startling finality. Moscow and Washington, so recently partners of necessity, grew distant again. The camaraderie of Allied victory banquets in embassies gave way to closed doors and careful, whispered warnings. For Americans embedded in Moscow and other former friendly territories, the onset of suspicion was almost palpable. Files stamped Allied one day were re-stamped enemy the next, and those who had toasted to victory together suddenly became separated by a new iron curtain, one built from secrecy and distrust rather than brick or barbed wire. The cityscapes themselves reflected this change. Corridors seemed longer, midnight traffic quieter, phone lines more obviously tapped. Stories drifted through the embassies, of informants hurriedly exfiltrated, of local guides now publicly disowned by patrons forced to abandon posts, of agents recalled to Washington, not with fanfare, but somber urgency. Some agents, lucky or careful, managed a discreet exit. Others simply disappeared into the opaque world they'd inhabited for years, their ultimate fates unrecorded and known only to the shadows. What set these late war missions apart was the knowledge that everything done in darkness would soon be judged by a different light. Operatives shifted from sabotage and immediate survival to a strange, lonely anticipation. What would happen to secrets once their keepers were no longer at war, but adrift in suspicion and reconstruction? Allies' lists of collaborators became bargaining chips. Hidden caches of arms were mapped for use in possible future uprisings, and desperate messages were sent, some never answered, across borders just closed by decrees or division lines. Amid this upheaval, the skills honed in wartime espionage, deceit perfected, trust in nothing but one's own resourcefulness, became habits that would define the coming era as much as any battle plan. The networks, loyalties, and betrayals forged in blood would persist, reshaped and repurposed for the rivalries of the Cold War. Those who'd survived these years, American agents and their allies alike, emerged changed, more skeptical, more guarded, bound together by knowledge unspoken and deeds that could never be catalogued or confessed in any peacetime report. By the time the final surrenders were signed, the agent's world was one where yesterday's victories were already overshadowed by the challenges and the perpetual ambiguities of a world divided not just between nations, but between truths that could never be fully told. The war was ending. The shadow game was remaking itself anew. With the echoes of surrender still fading across continents, the life of American secret agents did not so much end as evolve. The science of secrecy, once the purview of desperate survival, now became the backbone of a new world order. The skills forged in the crucible of war, their codes and ciphers, improvisations and betrayals, were not discarded but polished, institutionalized, and carried forward into an era defined as much by the threat of shadowy conflict as by moments of hard-won peace. For those who had survived their clandestine years, the return to ordinary life was nothing of the sort. The knowledge they carried of vanished allies, double-crossed informants, and codes that had once meant life or death was difficult to shed. Many agents vanished quietly into civilian professions, their heroism and hardship locked in classified reports, discussed only in smoke-filled backrooms as the fledgling Central Intelligence Agency emerged from the bones of the OSS. A select few, their exploits too valuable or their insights too sharp, became legends within an institution increasingly concerned with a new, unpredictable threat. The Soviet Union, once an ally, now the enigmatic adversary in a fresh, unending contest for influence and information. Networks built under fire did not dissolve with the peace. The men and women who had mapped the enemy's railways, recruited partisans, and cracked the codes of fascist war machines now faced new missions. To track communist influence in shattered post-war capitals, to smuggle scientists west before Soviet operatives could claim them, to keep secret arms caches ready for a war that already flickered behind the slogans of peace. American tradecraft matured. Lessons in compartmentalization, the need for plausible deniability, and the cultivation of local informants became gospel. Suitcases with false bottoms and microfilm, hidden in fountain pens, turned from inventions of desperation to tools of an emerging professional discipline. Yet the price of secrecy was high. Many agents found themselves haunted by what they had done and what they had seen. Paranoia, once a vital instinct, lingered as a shadow over marriage and friendship. Some trusted no one, forever wary that old betrayals might one day find them again. Others felt guilt over informants left behind, ambiguous missions, decisions forced by the unrelenting calculus of war. For a generation shaped by the clandestine fight, the world would remain, in some respects, perpetually coded. The official narrative sometimes celebrated these figures, but more often their contributions remained under state seal, anonymity, both shield and erasure. Occasional post-war declassification unearthed flashes of their impact. A resistance group saved by a well-timed warning, a coup averted, a defector's desperate journey plotted across borders closed by decree. But for every story told, 100 remained buried, details ever vulnerable to politics, policy, and the slow erosion of memory. What endured was the legacy of adaptation and resilience. American espionage, transformed by its early, often clumsy experiments in Moscow and across Eurasia, now set the template for a global struggle in which battles would be fought in whispers, with alliances as fleeting as the footprints left on a rain-slicked street. The Cold War would soon take on new forms: subterfuge, disinformation, proxy battles in jungles and deserts. But the psychological landscape, the sense of living under perpetual ambiguity, had already been mapped by those who had first played the shadow game. Beneath the official parades and declarations, America's secret agents, those who survived, those who vanished, those never truly accounted for, had helped shape the fate of nations. They belonged to a world always a step removed from the one reported in headlines, their victories unsung, their mistakes sometimes momentous. Theirs was the ultimate paradox. To protect their country, they had to live uncertain, unremarked, forever at the margins of recorded history. And so, as the world spun into its uneasy peace, the American secret agent carried forward the wisdom and the wounds of a life lived among shadows. Their war was over. Their vigilance, their legacy, was only just beginning. In the hush that followed the cataclysm of global war, a restless quiet settled over the world. But for America's secret agents, both the end and the aftermath carried their own particular burdens. The conclusion of open conflict never meant an end to secrecy. Instead, for many of those who had served in the clandestine battles of World War II, a new reality emerged: an endless continuum of vigilance, improvisation, and moral ambiguity. After the chaos of demobilization, some agents stepped easily into the roles of ordinary citizens, slipping back into lives and professions as if putting aside a borrowed coat. Yet the invisible threads of their former work tugged constantly: coded habits, the watchful way of walking a street, an aversion to trust, or the reflex fade into a crowd. Names and faces consigned to memory, moral equations never quite balanced, and the cost of knowing truths never meant for public record. These things lingered far longer than medals or official commendations. Others found the skills and lessons of espionage taking on new urgency as the wartime alliances collapsed into suspicion. The Soviet Union, once a necessary partner, grew inexorably into America's principal rival. With astonishing speed, the precursors to new organizations like the CIA absorbed knowledge, contacts, and talent forged during the war. Operation after operation, sometimes intended to gather intelligence, sometimes to disrupt, sometimes to defend against infiltration, persisted in an environment of declared peace and hidden war. Networks and relationships built during the years of Nazi occupation, Soviet purges, and ceaseless travel proved critical in the Cold War's first brushfires. Some of these agents became the architects of new clandestine campaigns across Eastern Europe, Asia, and Africa, their experience suddenly precious in a world where ideology and information held equal sway. The technologies of secrecy, silent cameras, radio transmitters, microdots, and intricate cipher systems rapidly grew more sophisticated, driven by the new race between East and West. The lessons learned in alleyways from Moscow to Manila, or on windswept hills from Normandy to the Yunnan, became the unseen foundation of a century. Methods refined by betrayal, triumph, and bitter compromise. And always, there was the reckoning. Many former operatives found themselves haunted. Faces lost, alliances broken, choices made in the fog of war that would have repercussions for decades. Old friends and former enemies crossed paths in neutral cities, the furtive nod enough to spark 1,000 silent memories. Some found vindication in the slow drip of declassified files, the rare acknowledgement on a roll of honor, the private relief of a life survived. Others kept their secrets until the end, weighted by the knowledge that even the just cause demanded costs no victory could redeem. For history, the legacy of these wartime spies is twofold. There is the tangible inheritance: global intelligence services, Standardized tradecraft. A permanent undercurrent of clandestine action, accepted as part of statecraft. But there is also the personal legacy of men and women driven by conviction, necessity, or the accident of skill to live at the edges of public life, where risk and lowliness were constants, and victories, when they arrived, were recorded only in shadows. So the story continues, each generation of agents inheriting and reshaping the traditions and burdens of those before them. In the years after the guns went silent, America's secret agents carried onward, not just as soldiers in a silent war, but as unwilling guardians of memory, duty, and the uneasy bargain drawn between freedom and the necessity of secrecy. Their war was never truly over. The world had changed, and in ways seen and unseen, the lives of its secret men and women had changed it forever. In the quiet aftermath of decades shaped by war and secrecy, the lives and legacies of America's secret agents reveal a story both monumental and deeply personal, one etched in shadows, coded whispers, and the silent sacrifices of individuals who lived between worlds. Their tale is not written in the grand histories of battles won or treaties signed, but in the invisible currents beneath them, where knowledge and courage intertwined with profound uncertainty. From the frozen streets of pre-war Moscow, through the cafes of occupied Europe, the jungles of Asia, and the shadowed alleys of uneasy alliances, these agents carried out their missions with a singular purpose, shaped by the urgency of their times. They mastered the art of invisibility, used the delicate dance of trust and deception, and risked everything in the hope that their work would save lives and shape a safer future. Often, that future looked back on them with silence, a silence born not of erasure, but of necessity. Their sacrifices, their stories, their triumphs and failures were classified, misunderstood, or forgotten by the world they served. Yet their imprint remains indelible. The clandestine networks they forged, the techniques they developed, and the human relationships they risked form the foundation of modern intelligence. Their experiences taught that in the theater of espionage, the lines between hero and victim are blurred, and that victory is often measured in the smallest, silent acts rather than grand gestures. The war they fought continues in new forms today, but the lessons born in their shadows endure. Courage tempered by caution, loyalty struggled for and never assumed, the grim calculus of survival amidst treachery. Behind the veil of secrecy, these agents bore the loneliness of those who carry truths too dangerous for daylight. Their legacy is a testament to the hidden complexity of war, that the battle is not only on the front lines of armies, but inside minds and across the unseen frequency of coded signals. They remind us that history is made not only by those who wield power openly, but also by those who, in quiet places, choose to confront danger for a cause larger than themselves. As the decades pass and archives slowly open, fragments of their stories emerge. Letters discovered, missions declassified, faces once hidden now honored. Yet the full tapestry remains unfinished, woven by countless unnamed men and women whose courage reshaped nations without acclaim. Their lives challenge us to see beyond the surface, to honor the sacrifices made in silence, and to understand the complex human cost of the battles that shape our world. In remembering America's secret agents of the World War era, we acknowledge a profound truth, that sometimes the greatest wars are fought not with guns in the streets, but with whispers in the shadows, and that those who fight them do so not for glory, but for the faint hope of peace.